Good morrow one and all, I'm Mr. King, and in these videos we're exploring how different critics respond to Hamlet in the last 400 years. And in the previous video we looked at 17th century responses to Hamlet. We saw views like Abraham Wright, who viewed Hamlet as a madman. But we learned that his view was not typical, as many 17th century critics viewed Hamlet as a strong, noble and heroic prince. Unfortunately, that view did not continue into the second half of the 18th century, and that's where we're going to pick up our journey today. And in particular, we're going to look at the views of two critics, the views of Voltaire and the views of Samuel Johnson, and we're going to dive straight in to the views of Voltaire. So, in the second half of the 18th century, French critic Voltaire wrote that Hamlet was a vulgar and barbarous drama. He goes further, writing, Hamlet becomes crazy in the second act, and his mistress becomes crazy in the third. The prince slays the father of his mistress under the pretense of killing a rat. Therefore, unlike 17th century critics who viewed Hamlet as a noble and heroic prince, Voltaire thought Hamlet was a thoroughly detestable play. But, like Abraham Wright in the 17th century, who said that Hamlet was an indifferent good part for a madman, Voltaire also views Hamlet as a madman, someone who genuinely descends into madness throughout the play. And this raises an important question. If Hamlet is mad, should this make audiences feel sympathy for him, or should it make us condemn him all the more? When Wright in the 17th century told us that Hamlet was a madman, he didn't explicitly say whether we should feel sympathy for him or condemnation. But we do know that many other 17th century critics felt Hamlet was worthy of sympathy. He was a hero after all. And presumably some of them agreed with Wright that he was genuinely mad, and therefore presumably some 17th century critics viewed Hamlet as mad but still worthy of some sympathy. Whereas Voltaire clearly thinks Hamlet is mad, but not worthy of sympathy at all. So who is correct? Well, helpfully, Shakespeare himself gives us a really helpful way to think about this dilemma. Is Hamlet's madness more like Ophelia's madness, or more like what Laertes goes through? Let me explain what I mean. How is Hamlet's madness like Ophelia's? Well, most productions of Hamlet portray Ophelia as someone who's driven to her wit's end, and generally audience give her loads of sympathy. She's driven to her wit's end because of Hamlet's actions and the death of her father, and as audiences we tend to feel lots of sorrow for her. Is Hamlet's descent into madness similar to Ophelia's, and therefore should we feel sympathy for Hamlet too? Alternatively, is Hamlet's madness more like what Laertes goes through? Maybe Laertes doesn't go mad, maybe madness isn't the right word to use for Laertes, but he certainly does go crazy with bloodlust and revenge in the play. Like Ophelia, he's deeply affected by the death of his father. He's also upset by the actions of Hamlet and also the death of Ophelia herself. And he goes into a crazy bloodlust mode. He storms into Denmark and challenges Claudius face to face with a group of men behind him threatening rebellion. He even risks going to hell by threatening to cut Hamlet's throat in the church. Now, Laertes tends not to get as much sympathy as Ophelia. So is Hamlet more like Laertes, someone who's consumed by revenge, someone who does go a bit crazy in the process, but he doesn't get as much sympathy and perhaps even a bit of condemnation? Which view do you think is correct? The 17th century critics, at least some of them we can assume, viewed Hamlet as a madman but might be worthy of some sympathy. That would make him a bit like Ophelia, whereas Voltaire viewed Hamlet as mad, vulgar and barbarous, making Hamlet's actions more like Laertes. One of the reasons Shakespeare gives us the characters of Ophelia and Laertes is because they function as foils to Ophelia, and Hamlet functions as foils to Ophelia and Laertes, and in doing so it's almost like Shakespeare's asking audiences, who is Hamlet like? Is he more like Ophelia or more like Laertes? Is he worthy of sympathy or is he worthy of condemnation? Which view of Hamlet do you prefer? Moving on, I'd also like to quickly look at the view of Samuel Johnson. Now, Samuel Johnson was one of the earliest critics to introduce the idea that Hamlet's madness was not real. He writes about the pretended madness or the feigned madness of Hamlet. Whereas earlier critics, to greater or lesser extents, wrote about Hamlet genuinely being mad, here Johnson says nope, Hamlet is faking madness. And his antidisposition is just that, it's just the disposition he chose to put on. Why does Johnson think that Hamlet is merely faking madness throughout the play? Well, he gives us 3 reasons. Firstly, Johnson argues that the contrast between the actions of Hamlet and Ophelia clearly shows a significant difference that can't be ignored. Ophelia's actions are clearly signs of genuine madness, according to Johnson, whereas Hamlet's actions are so radically different it can't be considered madness. He writes, "The pretended madness of Hamlet causes much mirth, whereas the mournful distraction of Ophelia fills the heart with tenderness." Secondly, Johnson writes, "Of the feigned madness of Hamlet there appears no adequate cause, for he does nothing which he might not have done with a reputation of sanity." This suggests that there is no sufficient reason for Johnson, throughout the play, to have caused Hamlet to go mad. Do you agree with that? Finally, Johnson points to Hamlet's vile treatment of Ophelia as evidence of his sanity. He plays the madman most when he treats Ophelia with so much rudeness, which seems to be useless and wanton cruelty. So, after scenes between Hamlet and Ophelia, such as Hamlet's cruelty in the Get Thee to a Nunnery scene, shortly followed by Hamlet's lewd sexualizing jokes during the Mousetrap play, Johnson sees not a madman, but a cruel man who's feigning madness and treating the people around him with utter contempt. If you wanted to find other evidence to support Johnson's claim that Hamlet is sane but faking madness, you could look to some of Hamlet's own comments about the issue. For example, his claim to Gertrude that "I essentially am not in madness, but mad in craft." In addition, I've always been really struck by how eloquent and thoughtful Hamlet is in his conversations with Horatio, with whom he can be completely honest. Because remember, Horatio was there when Hamlet declares his intention to act strange and odd and put on his antidisposition. I've always been particularly struck by some of Hamlet's final comments to Horatio in Act 5, Scene 2, as the play draws to a conclusion. Hamlet says, "We defy augury. There's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it will be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Since no man of aught he leaves knows what it is to leave betimes, let it be." These words, in which he accepts that so much of life is beyond his control, is such a deep and mature thought that it doesn't strike me as the thoughts of a madman. Is that because Hamlet swaps between being genuinely mad sometimes and sane at other times? Is he a bit like a Jekyll and Hyde character, switching between 2 different modes of being? Or is it because Johnson is simply correct? Hamlet is just a big faker who feigns madness throughout the play, and he's simply cruel. I suppose if you wanted to oppose Johnson's claim, perhaps you could point to the various appearances of the ghost throughout the play as something which would have shocked Hamlet into madness. Or perhaps you could point to the fact that Denmark was such a strong surveillance state, and Hamlet constantly feels watched by Claudius and Polonius, that could have pushed him into madness. Perhaps, as the nunnery scene suggests, that Hamlet was so distressed by Ophelia's rejection of him that could have pushed him into madness. Or perhaps the simplest solution is the best, that the revelation by the ghost that Claudius murdered his father pushed Hamlet over the edge into madness. Which view do you prefer? Do you prefer Wright and Voltaire's view that Hamlet genuinely descends into madness? Or do you prefer Johnson's view that Hamlet is merely pretending to be mad? And if Hamlet is pretending to be mad, how does that affect the way that audiences should view him? I'll leave those 2 views with you for now and ask you to consider them, and in our next video we'll be leaving the question of Hamlet's madness behind by travelling through the rest of the Romantic era and having a look at the bizarre and eccentric views of Sigmund Freud. But we'll leave it there for now, and until next time, cheerio.